Thanks for joining us. It is officially wildfire season 2025, and I'm joined once again by my friend Mike Flannigan, who is a wildfire professor at Thompson Rivers University, wildfire expert. Thanks for joining again here on the channel.
Well, great to be with you, Kyle.
So, first, let's take a look at the snow depth departure from average. I'd like to start with this slide because we can see basically here with this bold red line where the snow line is typically for April 23rd here. And, a lot of the snow is already melted out. You can see in areas where it's kind of blue and green there, it's above average snowpack at this time of the year. And then, of course, where there's those reds and grays below average. In some areas, it's white, which means the snow is melted out ahead of schedule there across parts of southern Northwest Territories, northern Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and parts of central interior there as well. So, as soon as those, snows completely melt out in the springtime, it's really dry out there, and we have what's called the spring dip. Mike, can you talk to us a little bit about what the spring dip means and why spring is very active for wildfire?
So I'm going to make a distinction. There's something I call the spring window, and then there's something that's called a spring dip. Okay, the spring window is after the snow melts, you have a lot of dead organic material from last fall, and it dries out quickly and can burn. And that's often when we see right across Canada, most pronounced in Alberta, but we see an increase or a starting of the fire season. Once the snow goes, and you get increase in human-caused ignitions. The spring dip often refers to the foliar moisture content. How dry or how wet are the needles on conifer trees? And in the spring, they have needles from last year or 2 years ago, and they're quite dry. The new growth hasn't started yet. And until things green up, it's very low moisture, which means it's prone to crown fires. A crown fire is where it spreads from the forest floor to the tops or crowns of the tree. So that's what people call the spring dip. So both are in play at this time of year.
Absolutely. And a lot of folks, it's kind of counterintuitive thinking the snow just melted. How can it be that it's fire season? But east of the Rockies, that's what's going on out there. I mean, right now, pretty quiet. This is our current active fires map here from CIFC, and we can see mostly just some under control fires. One out of control fire there in central BC, we'll talk about in a moment. But some of these larger fires up here, up north there, northwestern Alberta, I think some of these might be multi-year fires still. Hey, Mike?
Yes, a number of these fires start in 2023, burn through the winter, overwintering fires, or sometimes called zombie fires, and then continue to grow in 2024 and then survive this winter. And this is the first time I've seen fires in Canada survive 2 winters. And I've been watching fires closely since the 1970s, and this is the first, but fire continues to surprise me.
Absolutely. Drought on the landscape right now. Your eyes may be drawn to a couple of those areas where we're seeing severe drought here in parts of Western Canada. Southwestern Alberta here, we had a significantly below average snowpack through the winter months there. That could have some downstream implications into the summer, depending on how things play out as well. There's a pocket out there in the Caribou Chilcotin region there where we saw that one active wildfire that's still out of control at this moment. And then, of course, Northwest Alberta, Northeast BC, Southern Northwest Territories. This blob of persistent long term drought has been here really since the winter of 2022, 2023. And a lot of peatlands up there, those deep organic soils up there, they can really dry out and support those longer term fires. Maybe let's talk a little bit about why drought is important for sort of driving fire season.
Yes, there's a couple of reasons why drought's really important. And the first is the drier it is, the more of that vegetation, what fire people call fuel, has dried out. So the deeper layers are dry and ready to burn. So when the fire does come, it releases more energy. And a higher intensity fire is more difficult to extinguish than a lower intensity one. And also it means it burns deeply into the ground, which is harder to extinguish. You talk to a firefighter about mop up, and when it's droughty, it's hard work. The other aspect in places like northern Alberta, about 80% of the forested land is what we call uplands. And you give me, a week of hot, dry, windy weather, I can give you a raging inferno. But the other 20% are lowlands, wetlands, peat bogs, fens, marshes, and they're really good fire breaks in most years, except for drought years. So on non-drought years, a fire can spread upland and then bumps into these lowlands and it stops or goes very slowly and can be put out. On drought years, it can carry across the landscape and you get monstrous large fires because there's nothing to stop the fire.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, there's different fire regimes on both sides of the Rockies here in Canada, say these sort of large cold forests, the boreal forest, the taiga forest plains here in sort of southern Northwest Territories, moving down here across Alberta, northern Saskatchewan. We tend to see more frequent fires, those high intensity stand replacing fires in these black spruce forests here compared with, say, the mountains, the mountain forests of British Columbia, right? And I'm thinking specifically about this area in southwestern Alberta here with this prolonged drought that could be developing here. Banff saw its driest winter on record. This could potentially set up some fire hazard as we get into the summer months. These areas, some of these forests haven't burned in a really long time here compared with, areas of northern Alberta. How does it compare, from east and west of the Rockies, these different forested regions? Why do some areas burn more than others? And should we be concerned about southwestern Alberta this summer?
I am concerned about the Bow Valley and Banff. We've last year, unfortunately, we saw the Jasper fire. Not that long ago, 2017, we saw the fire in Waterton. It's long overdue in Banff, and so I am really concerned. I'm not saying it's going to happen this year, but sometime in the future, we're going to see fire in the Bow Valley, and we best be prepared. Yeah, the fire regimes are different. Parts of Saskatchewan, the conifers, they're born to burn. Okay, uh, that's their whole strategy. Some of them, lodgepole pine, jack pine, black spruce, have serotinous or semi-serotinous cones sealed with a waxy resin, and they actually need the fire to open the cones to release the seeds for the next generation. So they're prone to burn. Alberta is different in that May is the busiest month for fire. No other jurisdiction in Canada has that. And in part, that's because of the weather, in part because ignitions. We have lots of people on the landscape, and unfortunately, at times they start fires.
Absolutely. Speaking of those fires in the northeast part of British Columbia, there, you said it's kind of been burning since 2023. Wow, just like millions of hectares have burned in that kind of drought blob up there in northwest Alberta, northeast BC, hey?
Yeah, and this slides from a presentation last week by the BC Wildfire Service. They have a spring outlook, and it's done by Matt McDonald, and it's excellent, and it's on YouTube, BC government. Um, There's a couple of things here. Yes, these fires are huge, and so that limits how much landscape's left to burn. A recently burned area is unlikely to reburn for, in this part of the world, 10, 20 years. And if it's a wetland, more like 50 years. And the BC government has been working on some of the perimeters of these fires and so that they do not grow large again this year. That's the plan, and hopefully that comes to reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Great slide there from BC Wildfire Service. Here, the Basin Snow Water Index, again, looking at the snowpack across BC, we didn't get the snowier than average winter we were somewhat expecting in Western Canada with the La Nina. We did have a bit of a weak, brief La Nina. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but very dry conditions in terms of snow accumulation in, parts of central BC, that kind of Caribou, Chilcotin region, parts of the Southwest. Late March, we saw a few storms kind of come through the southern part of BC here, which improved the situation somewhat. But yeah, I mean, two questions about this map, Mike. First, with these drier conditions here, would we expect if conditions continue to be dry in the coming weeks, an earlier onset to fire season, in an area that typically tends to see fire season ramping up later in summer?
Yeah, it could be an early start. I mean, prime time for fire in BC is July and August, though in recent years we've been seeing more fires towards the end of June. Um, but yes, it's dry and it's ready to burn. And, one of the other controlled fires is exactly in that region. I'm also worried about the south near Washington border and Idaho and Montana. It's dry and, the southeast, we've seen lots of fire in BC, but the southeast has avoided most of it. Maybe not this year.
With that, that active storm track that delivered a lot of rain and snow in the southern interior, we've been seeing a pretty good flush of green in some interior valleys there. Later in the summer, again, if we stay relatively dry and we have this flush of green vegetation now, does that dry out and increase the fuel load for surface fires later in the season?
For those areas that don't have close canopy forests, grasslands, sage brush, um, when you have a wet winter, wet spring, it promotes vegetation growth. And then you get the hot, dry summer and it dies off. So it creates more fuel available to burn. This is true like in places like southwestern United States in the desert where they need a wet winter to get all that vegetation growth to provide the fuel, the biomass for the summer fires. And the same thing goes on in part to a smaller degree than places like, California, Arizona, but it does happen here as well.
Absolutely. And in terms of fire danger now, this is the percent of average precipitation that we've seen over the last 30 days or so. It's been pretty wet across southern British Columbia, much of southern and central Alberta. Great news for areas east of the Rockies there in time for planting season. A little bit wetter than normal across northern Alberta with some dry pockets here and there. This can quickly change. If we get some hot, dry, windy weather, fire danger can rapidly increase on the landscape. And of course, we've seen, there's already some elevated areas of fire danger. A lot of this is prairie, kind of near Grand Prairie, Peace River, Fort St. John region there. But we are starting to heat up a little bit in these forests. But really quickly, as we've said, the snow has melted out. Moving into early May, we could see a little bit of warm weather here across northern Alberta, and fire season could certainly be into full swing.
Yeah, I expect we'll see this map grow in area coverage and, probably in fire danger as we move into May.
Absolutely. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what we're looking at here?
So, in Canada, we get about 6,000 forest fires a year. About 50% are started by humans and about 50% are started by lightning, but there's a great seasonal variation. In spring, after the snow melts, you have all that dead organic material, and it's easy for a fire to start. But these are human-caused fires because lightning season really doesn't kick in most of Canada until later into May or even June, depending on where you are. But once you get into the summer, lightning-caused fires dominate. And then once again, the fall, lightning season ends, human-caused fires dominate, but not nearly as strong signal as in the spring with that spring window I talked about. And the day lengths are much longer in spring as opposed to October and November.
Yeah, for sure. And it means we got to really watch for some of those times in the summer or the spring where we get those what we call fire flaps as firefighters. Clusters of ignitions that happen all at once, right? Like there's times we really got to watch out for those in terms of, actioning these fires.
So yeah, fire is about the extremes, extreme fire weather, and also extreme ignitions. If you get a few fires here and there on a day, fire managements can handle them if they're unwanted fires. But the problem is when you get 100 ignitions in a day or a weekend, and that's happened. It's happened in Alberta, Slave Lake weekend, May 14th, 15th. There was over 100 new fire starts. BC, we see it a number of occasions where we get 100 new fire starts in 24 to 48 hours. And those are, I mean, fire management's challenging, but when you get events like that, you get overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Let's take a look forward into what we might be seeing this season. Now, a couple things to note. Long range forecasting is very challenging, especially during the summertime. In the winter, we have perhaps some stronger signals in the atmosphere and in the oceans that can kind of help us get a little bit more confidence in how things could play out. In the summertime, it's a little bit trickier, but we're going to take our best crack at it here. Lots of caveats, of course, but one of the things I like to do is look at sea surface temperature anomaly patterns. So that's what you're looking at here with this map. We can see, of course, where it's red here. That's where the seas are currently above normal, and the sea surface temperature rather is above normal. And then, of course, it's cooler than normal in these blues here. You've probably heard of the El Nino, La Nina, El Nino Southern Oscillation pattern here. That tends to be kind of measured in this area of the central and eastern tropical Pacific. We did have weak La Nina conditions through this winter that have already transitioned to neutral, meaning, of course, they're neither warmer or cooler than average in a significant way in this region right now. But that is one, and that's usually the strongest, what we call climate driver that kind of drives weather and climate on this on the scale of months. Months to a year, typically for ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. We look a little further to the north here in the North Pacific. We have another one, another sea surface temperature pattern that I'd like to highlight. We call it the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It is also an El Nino and La Nina like pattern, as in, we can see here with these cooler than average sea surface temperatures up the west coast of North America. We call this the cold phase or the negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, with warmer than average sea surface temperatures in the central North Pacific. And then, of course, it's just the opposite for the positive or warm phase of the PDO, with warmer than average conditions along the west coast of North America. Now, this is important because what these sea surface temperature patterns can do is actually drive the jet stream and the shape of the jet stream through the summer season. So, right here in the North Pacific, near this kind of this arc of volcanic islands, we call these the Aleutian Islands here off Alaska. And this is where there's a semi-permanent kind of area of low pressure here called the Aleutian Low. And, getting a little bit into the weeds here, but basically, when that low pressure area is stronger than normal, we have a stronger jet stream. But when we have this negative PDO, this cold PDO pattern, warmer than average sea surface temperatures in this region, that low pressure area is weaker than normal, which causes a weaker jet stream that does have the potential to kind of become wavier. It can get stuck in what we call blocking patterns. It just basically means the atmosphere can kind of get into a traffic jam. The jet stream can get stuck, and we get these prolonged areas of uh, you know, regions of upper high pressure, basically, that cause prolonged sinking air on the large scale, warm temperatures, dry conditions, and the onset of drought, which of course is a factor in wildfire. So all that's basically just a long-winded way to say that there are other seasons. When we're looking into seasonal forecasting, one of the tools we can use is called analog forecasting, basically just looking for other years that have looked similar in the past in terms of these sea surface temperature patterns, these climate drivers we've been talking about, as well as spatial patterns of drought and things like that. So other years that look similar to this year: 1967, 2009, 2018, 2001, and 2021. Some of these years were pretty bad for wildfires in Western Canada. So this is something that I'm personally looking at this year, and it's sort of it's jiving with our long range models that we'll look at in a little bit here. But in general, we have seen, in some of these sea surface temperature patterns, when we come out of a La Nina into neutral conditions into the summer, we have that cold negative PDO pattern, and sometimes even associated with this sort of what we call positive Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation with this warm kind of North Atlantic here. When they all conspire together, it can make certain types of weather and climate more likely over time. So, we can see less rainfall in a situation like this, more heat, more drought perhaps, and worse wildfire danger. So, looking at BC area burned, there's just one little bit of a correlation I wanted to discuss here. And I wanted Mike obviously to comment with his expertise. But notice here, we can see there was some activity back there in the 50s and 60s. This really noticeable quiet time in BC area burned through much of the 80s and 90s. I remember going to BC on vacation as a kid at that time and never dealing with wildfire smoke. But then since about Y2K, we've seen a rapid ramping up in that area burned here in British Columbia. And I wanted to take a look at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation during that same time frame here, largely negative through the 50s, 60s, and into the mid 70s. Significant swing into quite strongly positive through most of the 80s and 90s when we saw very quiet conditions in BC, and we've swung largely back into negative with a little bit of oscillation there, and that corresponding ramping up in fire, area burned in BC and right down the west coast into California as well. So a little bit of a correlation there, Mike.
Yeah, there's a relationship, all right. And, sea surface temperatures, ocean circulation does influence, global climate. And there's tons of papers on ENSO and global climate. And actually, for decades, fire researchers have been trying to use these oscillations or sea surface temperature anomalies to predict the fire season. And that work is still ongoing. With respect to this graph, I'd like to point out a couple of things, okay? The area in red, okay, 2017 to 2024 has more area burned than 1950 to 2016. And the top 5 years since 1950 have been 2023, 2018, 2017, 2024, 2021. Uh, yeah, just incredible increase in fire activity. And there's some really great papers by co-authors, Mark Prejean, Abrupt Increase in Fire in BC, it's called, and thus it is. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's a factor of 200, you know, a factor of 200 times more area burned in 2023 than there is in 2020. And the fuels are much the same because it's only a couple of years. So why is there such a large difference? And I may be biased, okay? Extreme fire weather and ignitions are playing a role. And that's why there's so much year-to-year variability is, how many of these extreme fire periods, those hot, dry, windy days, spread days we call them, how many do we get? Do we get ignitions with them? And when you do, look out.
Absolutely. And just taking a look here at this is sort of a multi-agency, many different forecast, long-range forecast models together in what we call an ensemble here, predicting that sort of ongoing negative Pacific decadal oscillation pattern through the summertime here with those relatively cooler than average sea surface temperatures along the west coast of North America. So something, a little bit nerdy, still a little bit in the weeds here, but this is something that we're considering in terms of the long range forecast, giving us a little bit more confidence. Let's just switch gears finally here into what could be coming first near term, and then we'll take a look at the longer term. Next 30 days here, based on the Euro, we can see quite a dry signal there in the mountains of Western Canada, across southern Alberta, and much of British Columbia there. It looks like the storm track may be off to the north here with those positive precipitation anomalies there in the Alaska Panhandle and across the Northwest Territories, but looks pretty dry for the next little while here, which could have implications on the start of, wildfire season here in Alberta, especially with slightly warmer than average temperatures forecast over the same sort of 30 days. But looks like a bit of a cool drought there in BC with colder than average temperatures at the same time that it's dry.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of February where we were cold and dry, which unusually dry for BC. So, as I mentioned, May is the month you got to watch out for in Alberta, whereas BC it's summer. But that dry scares me. If June stays dry, which it often doesn't, there's something we call the June monsoons that happen in BC and Alberta. And if you get June rains, that often helps the fire season. So we'll have to wait and see. But the thing that scares me is I, I seem to recall 2001 and maybe 2021 as well. We didn't get the June monsoons that we normally get, and that led to, significant fire years in parts of Western Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll take a look just at the end of the presentation at what 2021 kind of looked like. And getting a little bit further into the future here again, once again, this is our sort of multi-long range model ensemble here from a number of different agencies based on June, July, August. Pretty confident, good, strong signal there of warmer than average summer across much of Canada and the United States.
Hot summer. And we're seeing this almost every year now. And this is, a symptom of climate change. Our summer, it's getting warmer all year, including summer, which is our typical fire season.
Absolutely. For what it's worth here, take this one as a grain of salt because our long range forecast precipitation forecasts rather tend to have very low skill, but they're all kind of honing in on this relatively dry signal across much of Western Canada, northern US, central US plains. This type of setup would be very conducive to the development of drought across Western Canada, and we'll actually break it down into just a couple of these models individually here. This is the European model for April, May, June, and we're just going to go right through the summer months here: May, June, July, June, July, August, July, August, September. Warm, warm, warm in Western Canada there. Pretty strong signal. And as well, precipitation anomaly here, again from the European, very dry through the same time frame, basically April, May, June, July, August, and September. This would be pretty concerning in terms of the onset of drought across Western Canada. Agriculturally speaking, could lead to a more active wildfire season, especially it looks like the model's kind of really favoring maybe a semi-permanent jet stream here, this perma ridge in the summer over Western Canada with that storm track well to the north, bringing precipitation perhaps through, far northwest BC, Yukon, Northwest Territories. We'll see how this plays out in the long range, of course, because we got to take these forecasts with a grain of salt. Again, switching over to the Canadian, lots of agreement there. Again, April, May, June, July, August, very dry signal, especially in Western Canada, the Canadian prairies, and across much of the forested regions of Western Canada as well. So, a little bit concerned there. And just here to close it off, we can see as well the Canadian showing warmer than average conditions forecast for Alberta and BC, a little cooler to the east. But in general, there's a lot of agreement there. Warm, dry, hot, dry summer in Western Canada, which would really kind of play into that active wildfire season that we are anticipating in Western Canada. And how that might play out, just as a thought experiment here, it's certainly not guaranteed that it'll play out anyway, in any way like 2021 did. But this is this is our temperature anomaly for June, July, August in 2021, and we can see it was very, very warm across much of the northern, western United States, western Canada, and of course, much drier than average across the same area. And notice that those maps looked a lot like our forecast map. So if it does play out like 2021, at the start of the season in 2021, end of March there, we had significant drought across much of the southwestern US and a big pocket there in the northern plains, eastern Canadian prairies. And compared to this time, 2025, March 31st here, we can see also very kind of similar pattern here in Southwest states, a pocket there in the northern plains. Looks a little different in parts of Canada, but by the end of the summer of 2021, with that prolonged hot and dry weather, it was, there was widespread, severe, extreme, exceptional drought from BC right to the shores of Lake Superior. So, again, just a thought experiment, but with that type of weather, you can see the rapid onset of extreme drought. And so this is something we're certainly watching this year.
Yikes. Yeah.
2021 again, just to see kind of what the burned area looks like. Again, not expecting it. There's absolutely no guarantee it'll look the same, but that year, for just comparison's sake, we had a lot of fire activity across northern Saskatchewan, across much of Manitoba and Ontario, big burns in those areas. But of course, it was also very active west of the Rockies there, and it started early. That was that mega heat dome that we had end of June there, record, Canada's all-time record high in Lytton there. And the tragedy that ensued, and of course, other major fires in the southern interior that summer. So again, these are just kind of, hot, dry summers. We tend to see far more fire activity.
A fun fact for you, Kyle. I'm living in Kamloops, and our hottest day was during that heat event, and it was 47.3. Okay, Lytton was 49.5, but we were 40, which is really incredibly hot. I have a sister who lives in Tucson, and the hottest day they've ever had is 47.2. So I like to tease her that we're hotter than Tucson. And in terms of extreme temperatures, we are, which 47.3 is like 117 point something or another. Incredible.
Absolutely. You can just cook in those southwest BC valleys there. Finally, Mike, let's talk a little bit about what folks can do to prepare for this fire season, especially living in those forested areas of Western Canada.
So yeah, check out FireSmart, put it in your browser. There's FireSmart BC, there's FireSmart Alberta, there's FireSmart Canada. All have great information. There's 7 principles, but to me, some of the key ones are building materials should be non-flammable, and you should have no flammable material within 0.5 meters of your home. Recently in Jasper, for the new homes going up, they have to meet those 2 principles of Fire Smart, which I think is a great first step. I'd like to see, all communities that are high fire risk have mandatory Fire Smart. Yeah, I know I wouldn't be popular, but it really does help reduce the fire risk. Maybe before we close off, what we just saw, the dice are loaded, the indicators are, it looks like another busy fire season for BC and Alberta. But it will depend on the day-to-day weather that we see and the ignitions we get. And we can't do anything about lightning-caused ignitions, but in terms of prevention, be careful with fire. Put your campfires out. If there's no fire bans, observe fire bans. And of course, in BC and Alberta, we have great apps. Okay, BC Wildfire Service app. Alberta has an app. The BC one, you can actually take a picture if you see a fire and report it, and you can geolocate it. So great app, download it on your phone. If you're out in the woods, if you see a fire, report it, and also lets you know what fires are on the landscape so that you can be better prepared.
Absolutely. Well, as always, thanks. I appreciate your time and your expertise, Mike. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, great to be with you, Kyle. And maybe we can do a deep dive into blocking ridges and fire and, take take a look. And because we are seeing more blocking events, these upper ridges, and fire scientists have known for 60 years that blocking ridges are conducive to fire. So maybe we can take a closer look at that.
Definitely expecting to nerd out more in the coming weeks, create some more content with you. All right. Thanks a lot for joining. We'll talk to you next time.